The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Riverside Community Center, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Margaret Chen adjusted her wheelchair slightly, positioning herself at the perfect angle to watch the other children play. Today was supposed to be special. Today was her 9th birthday, and her father had rented the entire community center for what he called the Party of the Century. Richard Chen, CEO of Chen Technologies, had spared no expense. Rainbow balloons clustered at every corner, a professional DJ spun popular songs from a glittering setup, and a 3-tier princess cake sat majestically on the main table. Catered food filled multiple stations, from gourmet sandwiches to a chocolate fountain that bubbled invitingly. Everything looked perfect, exactly like the parties Margaret had seen in movies and dreamed about during lonely nights in the hospital. But dreams and reality rarely matched, and Margaret had learned this lesson too many times to count. She watched as her classmates clustered together near the bounce house, their laughter echoing through the spacious hall. None of them approached her corner, where her wheelchair sat parked beside a decorated table laden with untouched party favors. Her father had invited her entire 3rd-grade class, hoping that the excitement of a lavish party would somehow bridge the invisible gap that seemed to exist between Margaret and her peers. "Happy birthday, Margaret," called out Mrs. Patterson, her teacher, with that particular tone adults used when they felt sorry for someone. "Are you having fun, sweetie?" Margaret nodded and smiled, the same practiced response she had perfected over months of well-meaning questions. She had become an expert at hiding disappointment behind polite enthusiasm. "Yes, thank you. The cake looks beautiful." Mrs. Patterson's smile wavered slightly as she glanced around the room, taking in the same scene Margaret had been observing. Children ran and played, but they moved around Margaret's space like water flowing around a stone, acknowledging her presence with occasional waves, but never stopping to include her in their games. The truth was simple and painful. Margaret's classmates didn't know how to interact with her. When she had returned to school 6 months ago after the car accident that had changed everything, the other children had been curious at first. They had asked questions about her wheelchair, about whether it hurt, about whether she could feel her legs. But curiosity had quickly given way to awkwardness, and awkwardness had settled into the comfortable distance that now defined most of her relationships. Her father appeared at her side, his expensive suit slightly wrinkled from the stress of orchestrating what he had hoped would be a perfect day. Richard Chen was a man accustomed to solving problems through resources and determination, but his daughter's social isolation had proven resistant to both money and willpower. "How are you doing, Princess?" he asked, crouching down to her eye level. His voice carried the same forced cheerfulness that had become common in their house since the accident. "It's wonderful, Dad." "Really?" Margaret had become skilled at protecting her father's feelings. She could see the worry lines around his eyes, the way his hands clenched when he thought she wasn't looking. He blamed himself for the accident, even though everyone had told him it wasn't his fault. A drunk driver running a red light could have hit anyone. "Maybe we should cut the cake soon," Richard suggested, glancing at his expensive watch. "Get everyone gathered together." Margaret nodded, though the thought of standing alone next to the cake while everyone sang to her filled her with dread. She had experienced this ritual at other parties, the awkward moment when she became the center of attention not for who she was, but for the tragedy that defined how others saw her. Across the room, the community center's main door opened with a soft chime. A man entered, holding the hand of a young boy who looked to be about Margaret's age. The man was tall and athletic, wearing clean jeans and a button-down shirt that looked carefully pressed. His son wore similar clothing, and both of them paused just inside the doorway, taking in the elaborate party scene. The boy tugged on his father's hand and whispered something Margaret couldn't hear. The man nodded, and they moved further into the room, but unlike the other adults who had immediately found their social groups, This father seemed to be surveying the situation with careful attention. Marcus Williams had brought his son David to the community center for their weekly visit to the children's reading corner, not realizing that the space had been rented for a private party. As a single father working 2 jobs to make ends meet, Marcus was always careful about where they went and what they did, making sure David had enriching experiences without straining their tight budget. "Dad, can we stay a little bit?" David asked, his eyes wide as he took in the decorations and festivities. "I've never seen a party this big." Marcus hesitated. They clearly weren't invited guests, and he felt awkward about intruding on what was obviously an expensive private celebration. But as his eyes swept the room, he noticed something that made him pause. In the corner sat a young girl in a wheelchair, positioned perfectly to observe the party, but somehow separate from all the activity. Something about the girl's posture caught Marcus's attention. She sat very straight, with careful composure, but there was a loneliness in her positioning that he recognized. As a child, Marcus had often felt like an observer at the edges of other people's happiness, watching from the outside while others enjoyed experiences he couldn't access. "I think we should find somewhere else to read today," Marcus said gently to David. "This is someone's private party." But David had already spotted the girl in the wheelchair, and his 6-year-old sense of justice was immediately activated. "Why is she sitting by herself, Dad? It's not nice to leave someone alone at a party." Marcus followed his son's gaze and felt his chest tighten. The girl was beautiful, with long black hair decorated with a small tiara that suggested this was her birthday celebration. But despite being surrounded by what looked like her entire class, she was unmistakably isolated. "Sometimes people don't know how to include others," Marcus explained carefully. "It doesn't mean they're bad people. Sometimes they just don't know what to say." David considered this with the serious expression he wore when processing complex adult concepts. "But you always tell me that being kind is more important than knowing the right words." Marcus smiled despite the situation. His son had an uncanny ability to distill complicated social dynamics into simple truths. "You're absolutely right about that. So can we go say hello? She looks sad, and nobody should be sad at their own birthday party." The simple logic was irrefutable, but Marcus felt uncertain about approaching. He was a black man in what appeared to be an affluent social gathering, and experience had taught him to be careful about assumptions regarding his welcome in such spaces. The last thing he wanted was to create an uncomfortable situation that might reflect poorly on David or embarrass the birthday girl. But as he watched the scene unfold, Marcus noticed the girl's father hovering nearby with an expression of barely concealed distress. The man kept glancing around the room with the desperate hope of someone willing a solution into existence. Marcus recognized that look. It was the same expression he had worn during David's early social struggles after his mother had passed away 2 years ago. "What do you think we should do, Dad?" David asked, unconsciously echoing the question Marcus was asking himself. Before Marcus could respond, he caught the birthday girl looking directly at them. For just a moment, their eyes met across the crowded room. In that brief connection, Marcus saw intelligence, sadness, and something that looked like hope. The girl offered a small, tentative smile before quickly looking away. The decision made itself. "You know what, son? I think you're right. Nobody should feel alone at their own birthday party." Marcus took David's hand and began moving through the crowd toward the corner where Margaret sat waiting. As they approached, Marcus could see the girl's father notice their movement. The man's expression shifted from wariness to curiosity as he took in Marcus and David walking purposefully in their direction. Other adults in the vicinity began to take notice as well, conversations pausing as people wondered what was happening. Margaret watched them approach with growing interest. The man moved with quiet confidence, and his son walked beside him with the eager energy of someone on an important mission. They were both smiling, and their smiles looked genuine rather than the careful, sympathetic expressions she had grown accustomed to receiving. When they reached her table, Marcus stopped and offered a warm smile that reached his eyes. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying a gentleness that immediately put Margaret at ease. "I'm Marcus Williams, and this is my son, David. We were wondering if this might be your birthday celebration." Margaret nodded, suddenly feeling shy but not uncomfortable. "I'm Margaret Chen. Today is my 9th birthday." "Well, happy birthday, Margaret," Marcus said with sincere enthusiasm. 9 is a very important age. David here is 6, and he was just telling me how much he loves birthday parties. David stepped forward with the fearlessness that sometimes made his father both proud and nervous. "Your party looks really fun, Margaret. I've never seen a cake that tall before. Is it chocolate?" "The middle layer is chocolate," Margaret replied, feeling a spark of genuine excitement for the first time that day. "The bottom is vanilla and the top is strawberry. My dad said I could pick all the flavors." "That's the smartest thing I've ever heard," David declared with complete seriousness. "Why should you have to choose just one flavor when you can have all the good ones?" Margaret laughed, a real laugh that surprised her with its spontaneity. She couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to her like she was just a regular kid with regular kid logic. Marcus glanced around the room, taking in the elaborate decorations and the ongoing social dynamics. He could see Margaret's father watching their interaction with intense interest, and he made a decision that surprised even himself. "Margaret," he said, crouching down so they were at the same eye level, "David and I came here today to read some books together, but it seems like the reading corner is busy with your celebration. Would it be okay if we asked you a question?" Margaret nodded eagerly, drawn in by the genuine curiosity in his voice. "Would you and your dad mind if David and I joined your birthday party? We'd love to help you celebrate, if that would be all right with everyone." The question hung in the air for a moment, simple but loaded with possibility. Margaret felt her heart race with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe? Or gratitude? Or just the pure joy of someone wanting to be part of her day, not out of obligation, but out of genuine interest. She looked over at her father, who had moved closer to hear the conversation. Richard Chen was studying Marcus with the careful assessment he typically reserved for important business meetings, but Margaret could see something softer in his expression. "Dad?" Margaret asked, her voice carrying more excitement than it had all morning. "Would that be okay?" Richard extended his hand to Marcus, his businessman's instincts recognizing sincerity when he encountered it. "I'm Richard Chen, Margaret's father. You're both absolutely welcome to join us. In fact, I think that sounds like exactly what this party needs." As the two men shook hands, Margaret felt something shift in the atmosphere around them. Other children had begun to notice the interaction, drawn by the change in energy. The party suddenly felt different, more alive somehow, as if the simple act of genuine inclusion had awakened possibilities that hadn't existed before. David climbed into the chair next to Margaret's wheelchair, immediately launching into questions about the decorations and whether she liked the music. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Margaret found herself responding with matching energy, describing the party planning process and her father's elaborate surprise preparations. Marcus watched his son work his particular magic, the ability to connect with others that seemed to come naturally to him despite the challenges they had faced. As conversation flowed between the children, Marcus felt the familiar warmth that came from watching David be fully himself in the world. The party had found its missing element, though none of them fully understood it yet. Sometimes the most important moments begin not with grand gestures, but with simple questions asked with genuine care. And sometimes the answer to loneliness is found not in changing who you are, but in finding people who appreciate exactly who you are already. Margaret's birthday celebration was about to become something none of them had expected, but all of them needed. Within minutes of Marcus and David joining Margaret's table, the entire dynamic of the birthday celebration began to shift. David's animated storytelling about his adventures at the neighborhood park had Margaret laughing in ways that made her forget about her careful composure. Other children, drawn by the sound of genuine fun, began drifting closer to their corner. "And then the squirrel ran right up the slide backwards," David was saying, his hands gesturing wildly as he described his morning encounter. "I think it was showing off because there were people watching." "Squirrels are definitely show-offs," Margaret agreed seriously. "There's one outside my bedroom window that does backflips on the bird feeder. I think he knows I'm watching." Sarah Martinez, one of Margaret's classmates, had been hovering nearby, clearly wanting to join the conversation but unsure how to insert herself. David noticed her hesitation and immediately waved her over. "Hi, I'm David. What's your name?" "Sarah," the girl replied shyly, glancing between David and Margaret. "I like your story about the squirrel. Do you want to sit with us?" Margaret asked, surprising herself with how natural the invitation felt. "Sarah knows everything about animals. She wants to be a veterinarian." As Sarah settled into a nearby chair, Marcus found himself in conversation with Richard Chen. The two men stood a few feet away, close enough to supervise but far enough to let the children's friendships develop naturally. "I have to ask," Richard said, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. "What made you decide to approach Margaret? Most people tend to keep their distance." Marcus considered the question carefully. He had learned to be honest about difficult topics without being confrontational. "My son has a gift for seeing people as they really are, not as their circumstances define them." When he saw Margaret sitting alone, all he saw was a kid who might want some company at her birthday party. "And you supported that instinct?" "I try to follow David's lead when it comes to kindness," Marcus replied. "He's usually right about these things. Kids often understand inclusion better than adults do." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "Margaret has struggled socially since her accident. I keep thinking that if I create the right environment, provide enough opportunities, somehow I can solve this problem for her." "How long ago was the accident?" 8 months. Drunk driver ran a red light while we were coming home from her school play. Margaret was so excited to tell her mother about her performance." Richard's voice tightened slightly. "She doesn't remember the impact, which the doctors say is a blessing. But she remembers everything about before." Marcus felt the familiar weight that came with understanding another parent's pain. "David's mother passed away 2 years ago. Cancer. For months afterward, he struggled with making connections at school. Kids didn't know what to say to him about his loss, so they said nothing at all." "How did you help him through it?" "Honestly, I didn't do much. David figured it out himself mostly. He started approaching other kids who seemed lonely or left out, and somehow that became his way of processing his own experience. Turns out that helping others feel included helped him feel connected." Both men turned their attention back to the children's table, where the group had grown to include 4 classmates gathered around Margaret and David. The conversation had shifted to favorite movies, and Margaret was describing a film about dragons with the kind of enthusiasm that had been absent from her voice all day. "She looks happy," Richard observed, and Marcus could hear the wonder in his voice. "Actually happy. Not just politely going through the motions." "Your daughter's got a great smile," Marcus said. "David noticed it right away. He told me yesterday that smiles are like languages, and some people speak it better than others." 6-year-old philosophy? "The best kind. No complicated agenda, just truth as he sees it." Their conversation was interrupted by Linda Hoffman, one of the other mothers who had been watching the interaction with growing interest. Linda was known in their social circle for her strong opinions and her tendency to voice them without much consideration for timing. "Richard," she said, approaching with the purposeful stride of someone on a mission. "I couldn't help but notice your new guests. Are they family friends?" The question carried an undertone that both men recognized immediately. Marcus felt his shoulders tighten slightly, a defensive response developed over years of navigating similar moments. Richard, to his credit, picked up on the subtext and responded with cool professionalism. "Linda, I'd like you to meet Marcus Williams and his son David. They were kind enough to join Margaret's celebration today." "How lovely," Linda replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And how do you know the family, Marcus?" "We just met today," Marcus answered evenly. David and Margaret discovered they have a lot in common. Linda's expression shifted slightly, confusion replacing her initial assumptions. "Oh, well, that's nice. I just thought, with the way they were talking, I assumed you'd known each other for ages." "Sometimes connection doesn't require history," Richard said, his voice carrying a subtle edge. "Sometimes it just requires openness." The comment hung in the air for a moment before Linda excused herself, clearly realizing that her fishing expedition had not yielded the information she had expected. Marcus watched her retreat with practiced calm. "Happens more often than you might think," he said quietly to Richard. "I'm sorry about that. Linda means well, but she has a habit of making assumptions." "No apology necessary. I've learned to judge people by how they respond to these moments, not by whether the moments happen in the first place." Their conversation was interrupted by excited voices from the children's table. Margaret was describing her collection of books to an increasingly interested audience, and David was promising to bring some of his favorite stories to share with her. "Margaret loves to read," Richard explained to Marcus. "Before the accident, she was always too busy with activities to spend much time with books. Now she reads constantly. It's become her primary escape." David's the same way. "The library is our second home. We go there every week, sometimes twice if he's discovered a new series." "What kind of books does he like?" "Adventure stories, mostly. Anything with kids solving problems or going on journeys. He's drawn to stories about characters who have to figure things out on their own." Richard smiled. "Margaret gravitates toward fantasy novels. Dragons, magic, characters who discover they have special powers they never knew they possessed." "Makes sense. Sometimes we need stories that show us possibilities beyond our current circumstances." As if summoned by their conversation, Margaret called out to her father. "Dad, can David come to our house sometime? He wants to see my book collection, and I want to show him the garden." The request was simple, but Richard recognized its significance immediately. Margaret hadn't asked to have a friend over since the accident. Her social interactions had been limited to school obligations and family visits that felt more like duty than pleasure. "That sounds like a wonderful idea," Richard replied. "Marcus, would that work for you and David?" "David would love that. We'd be happy to visit, if you're sure it's not too much trouble." "No trouble at all. Actually, it would be my pleasure." Sarah, who had been listening to the exchange, spoke up hesitantly. "Could I come too? I'd like to see Margaret's books." Soon, other children were expressing interest, and Margaret found herself at the center of social planning for the first time in months. The birthday girl, who had started the day sitting alone, was suddenly coordinating multiple future playdates with genuine excitement. Mrs. Patterson approached the group with amazement written across her face. "Margaret, I haven't seen you this animated in class all year. You should invite David to visit our classroom sometime." "Could he really come?" Margaret asked, turning to David with hopeful eyes. "I'd love to see your school," David replied enthusiastically. "Is it big? Do you have a library there too?" As the children continued chattering about future adventures, Marcus found himself reflecting on the unexpected turn their day had taken. He had brought David to the community center for their quiet weekly routine, and instead, they had stumbled into what felt like the beginning of a meaningful friendship. "Time for cake," Richard announced, and the entire party gathered around the elaborate three-tier creation that had seemed almost tragically wasteful just hours earlier. But now, as Margaret sat surrounded by children who were genuinely excited to celebrate with her, the cake felt perfectly proportioned to the joy in the room. David positioned himself right next to her wheelchair, appointed himself the birthday song conductor, and led the entire gathering in the most enthusiastic rendition of Happy Birthday Margaret had ever experienced. When she blew out the candles, Margaret made a wish she had never thought to make before. She wished for more days like this one, filled with unexpected friendship and genuine connection. As cake was distributed and conversations flowed naturally around them, Marcus caught Richard's eye across the room. Both fathers shared a moment of understanding that needed no words. Sometimes the most important gifts come in forms we never expected, from people we never saw coming. Margaret's laughter rose above the general party chatter, bright and unrehearsed. David's responding giggle created a harmony that seemed to lift the spirits of everyone around them. Other children began sharing their own stories, creating an atmosphere of inclusion that spread throughout the entire celebration. The party that had started as an expensive attempt to buy social acceptance had transformed into something much more valuable, a genuine community of children who had discovered they enjoyed each other's company. Linda Hoffman, watching from across the room, felt a small twinge of recognition. Her own assumptions had been challenged by the simple reality of children being kind to each other. Sometimes growth comes from unexpected sources, and sometimes the people we are quickest to judge turn out to be exactly what a situation needs. As the afternoon continued, Margaret found herself experiencing something she had almost forgotten was possible. She felt normal, not like a girl in a wheelchair, not like someone to be pitied or carefully managed, but like a regular 9-year-old having fun at her birthday party with friends who genuinely enjoyed her company. The transformation was so complete that when it came time for David and Marcus to leave, Margaret felt a genuine pang of disappointment rather than the relief that usually accompanied the end of social gatherings. "This was the best birthday party ever," she told David as they said goodbye. "It was my first birthday party," David replied with typical honesty. "But now I know why people like them so much." The simple exchange captured everything that had made the day special. Margaret had experienced genuine celebration for the first time since her accident, and David had discovered the joy of being included in someone else's happiness. As father and son walked toward the community center exit, Marcus reflected on the afternoon's events. They had entered the building as strangers looking for a quiet place to read, and they were leaving as part of something larger. David had found a friend who matched his enthusiasm for stories and adventures, and Marcus had connected with another father navigating the challenges of raising a child who needed extra support and understanding. The birthday party had become something none of them had expected, but all of them had needed. And the relationships formed that day were just beginning to reveal their potential for changing everyone involved in ways they could not yet imagine. 6 months after Margaret's 9th birthday party, the Chen family's Sunday mornings had developed a rhythm that would have been unimaginable before that transformative day at the community center. Margaret wheeled herself to the front window of their suburban home, watching eagerly for the familiar sight of Marcus Williams' aging Honda Civic turning into their circular driveway. "They're here!" she called out, her voice carrying the same excitement that had become her trademark whenever David was scheduled to visit. The change in Margaret's overall demeanor had been so dramatic that her physical therapist had commented on how much her posture and confidence had improved since she had started making regular social connections. David burst through the front door with his usual enthusiasm, carrying a backpack stuffed with new library books and his latest art project from school. At 7 now, he had grown taller and more confident, but his fundamental kindness and direct way of seeing the world remained unchanged. "Margaret, you have to see this story I found," he announced, pulling a thick picture book from his bag. "It's about a girl who talks to trees, and the trees help her solve mysteries in her neighborhood." "That sounds perfect for our book club," Margaret replied, referring to the informal reading group that had grown out of their friendship. What had started as just the two of them sharing stories had expanded to include Sarah, two other classmates, and surprisingly, several children from David's school who had heard about their weekly discussions. Marcus followed his son into the house, carrying a casserole dish that had become his standard contribution to their Sunday gatherings. Over the past months, he and Richard had developed their own friendship, bonded initially by their children's connection, but sustained by genuine mutual respect and shared experiences as single parents navigating complex challenges. "How's the presentation coming along?" Marcus asked Richard, referring to the Community Accessibility Initiative that Richard had been developing for the past 3 months. "Better than expected. The City Council is actually interested in implementing some real changes. Margaret's been helping me understand what modifications would make the biggest difference for kids her age." This collaboration had emerged naturally from conversations about Margaret's daily experiences. Richard's business background had combined with his new perspective as a parent of a child with disabilities to create advocacy opportunities he had never previously considered. Margaret's input had transformed what might have been a theoretical proposal into a practical plan for improving accessibility throughout their community. "Dad's going to present to the school board next month," Margaret added proudly. "They want to make all the playgrounds accessible for kids who use wheelchairs or have other mobility challenges." David nodded approvingly. "That's really important. Everyone should be able to play together." The simple statement embodied the principle that had guided their friendship from the beginning. David's matter-of-fact acceptance of Margaret's wheelchair had influenced other children in ways that formal inclusion programs had failed to achieve. His natural assumption that friends adapt to include each other had created a social dynamic where accessibility became a shared responsibility rather than a special accommodation. Their Sunday routine had evolved into a multi-family gathering. Sarah's parents now brought their daughter regularly, and the Martinez family had become close friends with both the Chens and the Williams. The informal network had grown to include several families who had discovered that their children thrived in an environment where difference was treated as normal variation rather than something requiring special attention. "Where's David today?" asked Elena Martinez as she arrived with Sarah and her younger brother Carlos, who had developed his own friendship with David despite the age gap. "He's showing Margaret his new art project," Marcus replied. "Something about designing a playground that would work for everyone." This project had captured David's imagination after visiting several playgrounds with Margaret and noticing how many activities were inaccessible to children who couldn't walk or climb traditional structures. His 6-year-old solution-oriented thinking had produced drawings of ramps, swings with supportive seating, and sandboxes positioned at multiple heights. "I want to be an architect when I grow up," David had announced the previous week, "but I want to design places that work for everyone, not just some people." Margaret had immediately declared her intention to become an urban planner, specializing in accessibility consulting. "We can work together," she had suggested, with the confidence of someone who had learned that her ideas had value and that other people wanted to collaborate with her. The transformation in Margaret's self-perception had been perhaps the most remarkable outcome of the relationships that had formed around her birthday table. The girl who had once sat carefully composed, managing other people's discomfort with her wheelchair, had become a vocal advocate for inclusion and a natural leader among her peers. "Margaret's been selected for the student council," Richard announced to the gathering. "She's running on a platform of making the school more welcoming for everyone." This development had surprised no one who had watched Margaret's growing confidence over the past months. Her experience of genuine inclusion had taught her both the value of belonging and the skills necessary to create it for others. "I'm going to propose buddy programs between different grade levels," Margaret explained. and suggestion boxes where kids can anonymously report when someone is being left out. David gave me the idea after he told me about helping a new student at his school. David's reputation as a friendship facilitator had continued to develop at his own school. Teachers had begun asking him to partner with new students or children who were struggling socially. His natural ability to see past surface differences and connect with others had become a recognized asset in his classroom community. Marcus watched his son explaining his playground designs to an increasingly engaged audience of children and adults. David's enthusiasm was infectious, and his ideas were surprisingly sophisticated for someone his age. More importantly, his approach to problem-solving reflected values of inclusion and cooperation that Marcus hoped would stay with him throughout his life. The Sunday gathering had evolved into something that benefited all the families involved. Parents shared resources, offered mutual support, and celebrated each other's successes. Children experienced friendship across age groups, cultural backgrounds, and ability levels. The informal community had become a source of stability and joy for everyone involved. "I have some news to share," Richard said, as the group settled around the large dining table for their weekly meal. "Margaret's physical therapist thinks she might regain some sensation in her legs over the next few years. It's not a guarantee, but there have been positive changes in her most recent evaluations." The news was met with excitement, but Margaret's response was perhaps the most telling indicator of how much her perspective had changed. "That would be amazing," she said thoughtfully. "But even if it doesn't happen, I'm not worried about it anymore. I've learned that I can do everything I really want to do, just sometimes in different ways than other people." David nodded seriously. "Besides, you're already faster than most people in that wheelchair. I can barely keep up when you race down the hill at the park." The comment prompted laughter and launched a discussion of Margaret's increasing athletic interests. She had recently joined a wheelchair basketball league and discovered she had considerable talent for the sport. Her competitive spirit, which had been subdued during the months immediately following her accident, had returned with remarkable intensity. Marcus reflected on how much his own life had changed since that day at the community center. His friendship with Richard had provided him with professional opportunities he wouldn't have encountered otherwise. Richard's business connections had led to a promotion at Marcus's primary job and consulting opportunities that had significantly improved their financial situation. More importantly, David had gained an extended family of adults who cared about his development and children who valued his friendship. The network of support had allowed Marcus to focus on his career growth without worrying that David was missing out on enriching experiences or stable relationships. "I've been thinking about organizing a community accessibility fair," Elena Martinez suggested. "Something where local businesses and organizations could learn about simple changes that would make their spaces more inclusive." The idea sparked immediate enthusiasm from the group. Margaret volunteered to create informational materials, David offered to design promotional artwork, and Richard proposed using his business connections to recruit participants. "We could have it at the community center," Marcus suggested, "come full circle to where all of this started." The symmetry of the proposal appealed to everyone. The same space where Margaret had sat alone at her birthday party would become the venue for a celebration of inclusion and community connection. As the afternoon wound down and families began preparing to leave, Margaret found herself reflecting on how profoundly her life had changed since her birthday. The girl who had once measured success by how well she could hide her sadness now measured it by how effectively she could create opportunities for others to experience the belonging she had discovered. "Thank you for coming to my birthday party," she said to David as he packed his books and art supplies. "Thank you for inviting us to stay," David replied, referring to that first day when they had been strangers looking for a place to read. "I didn't really invite you. You just asked if you could join me. Same thing. You said yes, and that made all the difference." The simple exchange captured the essence of what had made their friendship transformative. Margaret had learned that she didn't need to earn inclusion through being perfect or undemanding. She simply needed to be open to connection when it was offered genuinely. David had discovered that his instinct to reach out to others who seemed lonely was not just kindness, but a form of wisdom that could change entire social dynamics. Marcus and Richard shook hands at the front door, a gesture that had evolved from polite formality to genuine affection over the months of shared experiences. "Same time next week?" Richard asked. "Wouldn't miss it," Marcus replied. "David's already planning next Sunday's book discussion." As the Williams family drove away, Margaret positioned herself at the front window to wave goodbye, a ritual that had become important to both children. Richard joined her, watching their friends disappear around the corner. "Happy?" he asked, though he could see the answer in his daughter's relaxed posture and genuine smile. "Very happy," Margaret confirmed. "I can't wait for next Sunday." The birthday party that had started as Richard's desperate attempt to purchase social acceptance for his daughter had evolved into something much more valuable, a genuine community built on mutual care and authentic friendship. Margaret's 9th birthday had become the foundation for relationships that would shape all of their lives for years to come. In the quiet of the Sunday evening, as Margaret worked on homework at the kitchen table and Richard prepared for the coming week, both of them reflected on how much their world had expanded since a father and son had asked a simple question: "Can we join you?" Sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest acts of courage. And sometimes the answer to isolation is not found in changing ourselves to fit in, but in finding people who appreciate us exactly as we are. Margaret Chen had learned both lessons at her 9th birthday party, and the knowledge had transformed not just her life, but the lives of everyone who had been touched by the friendships that began that day. The community that had formed around a lonely girl's birthday table continued to grow, creating ripples of inclusion and acceptance that extended far beyond what any of them had imagined possible. And at the center of it all remained the simple truth that David Williams had understood from the beginning. Everyone deserves to feel like they belong, and most of the time, all it takes is someone willing to ask if they can sit down and be part of the celebration,